He came for her at midnight, and Seraphina Belmont was not afraid. That was the first thing Draven Malkavian noticed when he stepped through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor penthouse. His white hair catching the city light like a crown of frost, his obsidian coat settling around him as though even gravity paid its respects. He had crossed oceans for this moment. He had endured 3 centuries of blood law and political maneuvering, and the suffocating weight of a vampire court that had decided, in its cold and ancient wisdom, that the last surviving heir of the Belmont family belonged to them. He had expected tears, he had expected bargaining, he had expected the particular brand of human terror that smelled like copper and desperation. Instead, Seraphina Belmont stood at the center of her living room with a crystal glass of red wine held loosely in one hand and her dark eyes fixed on him, with the calm, calculating intelligence of someone who had been expecting him for quite some time. "Lord Malkavian," she said, and her voice was steady as bedrock, "you're 40 minutes late." The city sprawled behind her through the panoramic windows, a million lights blinking in the dark like scattered stars, entirely indifferent to the fact that the most dangerous vampire lord in the Northern Covenant had just materialized in a human woman's penthouse with a binding order tucked inside his coat pocket. Draven's pale eyes narrowed. In 347 years, not a single human had greeted him, as though he were a delayed dinner guest. "You knew I was coming," he said. "It was not a question. I've known for 6 weeks." She took a composed sip of her wine, and the gesture was so deliberately unhurried that it struck him almost as a challenge. "I know about the blood law. I know about the tribunal's ruling. I know that the Belmont line carries debt to the Northern Covenant, that my grandfather buried in documents he hoped no one would ever find." She tilted her head, and the lamplight caught the sharp intelligence in her face. "I've spent 6 weeks reading those documents, all of them." Something shifted behind Draven's pale eyes. He had anticipated resistance. He had not anticipated this. "Then you understand," he said carefully, his voice the low, resonant thing that had silenced vampire courts and broken human wills for generations, that the ruling is binding. You are the last of the Belmont bloodline. Under the ancient vow your grandfather signed 3 generations ago. You belong to the Covenant. I belong to no one, Seraphina said. And the words were not defiant so much as simply factual. She set her wine glass down on the marble table beside her with a soft, precise click. "And before you reach for that binding order in your left breast pocket, you should know that I have something you need. Something considerably more valuable than one human heiress delivered to a court that will use her as a political ornament." Draven went very still in the way that only the truly ancient could, with the absolute, unnerving stillness of something that did not need to breathe. "Speak carefully," he said. "Always." She crossed to the sleek black desk beneath the second window and withdrew a leather-bound file. She held it up. "The Aegis Codex, the original, not the fragments your court has been chasing for 60 years. The complete document, with the full terms of every blood law binding your Northern Covenant together, including the hidden clause that your rival, Lord Vasile Cravenmore, has been quietly exploiting for the past decade to undermine your authority." The silence between them was so absolute it had a texture to it. "That document," Draven said slowly, "was destroyed in the Covenant Purge of 1963. It was hidden," Seraphina corrected, "by my grandfather, who understood, apparently, that an original Covenant document was worth more to the Belmont family's survival than any number of diplomatic promises." She lowered the file and looked at him with those dark, steady eyes. "Vasile Cravenmore has been building a case against you for 11 years, Lord Malkavian. He's been quietly gathering proxy votes from minor lords, using a misreading of Blood Law Article 17 to suggest your authority over the Northern Territories is ceremonial rather than absolute. In 8 months, he plans to call a tribunal." She paused. "I know this because I've spent the last 6 weeks not only reading the codex, but cross-referencing it against every leaked court document my family has accumulated over 3 generations of being the Covenant's very reluctant human allies." Draven Malkavian, Lord of the Northern Covenant, master of 4 centuries of political survival, was quiet for a long moment. Then, for the first time, he moved further into the room. He was extraordinary to look at. Seraphina had known he would be. The way you know intellectually that standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon will be impressive without fully understanding what that means until the ground drops away beneath your feet. He was tall in a way that rearranged the proportions of whatever room he entered. His hair was the white of deep winter, falling in clean lines to his jaw, and his skin was the pale, luminous tone of old marble warmed by candlelight. He moved with the fluid, unhurried grace of something that had never needed to rush, something that had all the time in the world and knew it, and his face. Seraphina had studied photographs, because of course the Covenant had surveillance, and of course a prepared woman got ahead of that. The photographs had not captured the quality of his features, the severe, architectural beauty of them, the way his pale grey eyes held 4 centuries of weight and intelligence, and something she had not expected to find there at all, something that looked, at close range, almost like loneliness. "Sit down," he said, and it was definitely a command, but she sat because it suited her to do so, and not for any other reason, and she suspected from the slight shift in his expression that he understood the distinction perfectly. He sat across from her, and the two of them regarded each other in the low light of the 42nd floor, while the city hummed its indifferent modern song below them. "Show me the document," he said. She opened the file and laid it on the table between them. He leaned forward and she watched his pale eyes move across the pages with the focused speed of someone who had read Latin in its original political context and found modern legalese quaintly derivative. He read for 4 minutes without speaking. She watched his jaw tighten once, a small controlled movement. "Article 17, subsection 9, he said quietly. He has been reading it as discretionary. When the original intent was mandatory, Seraphina confirmed. The word shall was mistranslated in the 1904 copying. The original codex makes it unambiguous. Your authority over the Northern Territories is absolute and non-delegable. Vasile Cravenmore's proxy coalition collapses the moment you present this document to a full Covenant tribunal." Draven sat back. He looked at her with an expression that was not easy to interpret, which she suspected was intentional. Vampires of his age and rank had centuries of practice making their faces unreadable. But the human quality of his attention, the full, focused weight of it directed entirely at her, was something she felt along her spine. "Why," he said, with the careful enunciation of someone choosing every word with precision, "would you give me this?" "I'm not giving it to you," she said. "I'm trading it for your freedom from the blood law, partially." She folded her hands on the table. "I want the debt discharged. I want the Belmont family's 3-generation obligation to the Northern Covenant formally terminated, witnessed by the full tribunal, and written into the permanent record so that no future Covenant lord can revive the claim against my family line." She held his gaze. "And I want your word. Not the Covenant's word, yours. Personally." Something in his expression changed. It was subtle, a minute shifting of the weight behind his eyes, but Seraphina was very good at reading people, and she caught it. "You know what my personal word means," he said. "I know that a vampire lord's sworn personal bond is unbreakable," she said. "I know that if you give me your word and break it, you forfeit your authority over every vampire who has ever pledged to your house, permanently and irrevocably. I know this because it's in the Codex, Article 4, subsection 2. She met his pale gaze without flinching. "So yes, that is precisely what I'm asking for." Draven Malkavian was quiet for a long time. The city lights moved behind him like slow, distant fire. "You are," he said finally, and there was something in his voice that she could not quite classify, something between reluctant and almost admiring. "Quite extraordinary, Miss Belmont." "I'm a Belmont," she said simply. "We've been surviving vampire courts for 3 generations. I've had a great deal of preparation." He gave his word. He laid the binding order on the table between them, unsigned, and he spoke the ancient formula of personal bond in Old Covenant Latin, and the air in the room did something that Seraphina felt rather than saw, a subtle pressure, a shift in the atmosphere, the way the air changes before a thunderstorm. When it was done, he sat back and looked at her with those pale, century-deep eyes, and she thought she understood then what she had seen in the photographs and could not name. He had been doing this alone for a very long time. "The Codex," he said, "will require verification before I can present it to a tribunal. The document will need to be authenticated by a Covenant archivist." "I know." That is why I also have all 6 of my grandfather's authentication letters from the original Covenant archivist, who helped him secure the document in 1961. She produced a second sealed envelope from the file. Authenticated chain of custody. Complete. He looked at the envelope. He looked at her. And for just a moment, the absolute composure of his face broke just slightly, and what moved behind his eyes was something that felt startlingly like wonder. "Your grandfather," he said, "was a remarkable man. My grandfather was a terrified man who loved his family enough to be remarkable anyway," she said. "There's a difference. And that was, though neither of them knew it yet, the precise moment that everything between them began to change. He did not leave that night. He told himself it was because the codexes required immediate strategic review, and it was more efficient to work from the location where the supporting documents were stored. He told himself that the Belmont family's accumulated intelligence on Covenant politics was operationally valuable, and that Seraphina Belmont was, inconveniently, the only person who understood all of it. He told himself these things with the practiced discipline of 4 centuries, and Seraphina, who was watching him tell himself these things with an expression of polite neutrality, did not challenge him on any of them. They worked through the night at her dining table, the codex and its supporting documents spread between them, Seraphina's laptop open to her meticulously organized research files, Draven's knowledge of Covenant history filling in the gaps between the documents with 3-dimensional political context that transformed dry records into a living map of a conspiracy. At some point around 3 in the morning, she made coffee without asking and set a mug beside him, and he looked at it with the particular expression of someone who has not been offered coffee by a human in a very long time and does not quite know what to do with the feeling it produces. "You don't have to drink it," she said, already back in her chair and scrolling through another file. "I just find it rude to make coffee for only myself when there's someone else in the room. I appreciate the courtesy," he said, after a moment, and his voice was slightly different than it had been 3 hours earlier, slightly less guarded around its edges. "Article 23, she said, pulling up a scan. "Look at this cross-reference." They worked until dawn. She fell asleep in her chair at approximately 5:15, her head dropping to her folded arms on the table with the graceless suddenness of someone who had been holding themselves awake through pure determination and had simply run out of determination. Draven became aware of this perhaps 20 seconds after it happened. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment, then gathered the documents she'd been working on into a careful, ordered stack so they would be easy for her to find when she woke, and drew the cashmere throw from the back of the couch and laid it over her shoulders with a gentleness that he would have found difficult to explain. Then he moved to the far side of the penthouse, where the blackout panels she had already installed in the guest room told him clearly that she had prepared for the possibility of exactly this, and he rested. When she woke 4 hours later, she found the documents neatly organized, a note in the crisp, formal handwriting of someone educated before typewriters that read, "Cross-reference Article 23 with the 1987 Corvinus Summit records. The relevant file is 3rd from the left in your second stack." And beside the note, a second cup of coffee, still warm. She stared at the coffee for a moment. She picked it up, took a sip, and went back to work. This became, over the following days, a pattern that neither of them named. He stayed because the strategy required it, because dismantling Vasil Cravenmore's 11-year conspiracy could not be accomplished in a single night, and the Belmont archives were uniquely relevant to the process. Because he needed a human liaison who understood both Covenant law and modern investigative methodology, and Seraphina Belmont was, without question, the most qualified candidate for that role anywhere in the world. He stayed because it was logical. He did not examine the other reasons, which were less logical but considerably more persistent. The thing about Seraphina was that she was never what he expected. She was not passive in the way that humans often became around him, made small and careful by the weight of his presence. She pushed back on his interpretations of political strategy with specific, well-sourced arguments. She corrected his mistranslation of a 14th century legal clause with brisk efficiency and moved on without making a moment of it. She challenged his reading of Cravenmore's motivations and when he explained his reasoning, she listened with absolute, focused attention and then said, "You're right. I was wrong," with the same directness with which she had challenged him, without embarrassment or deflection. It was, he found, deeply unusual and deeply compelling. On the fourth night, she told him about her grandfather. They were in the sitting room, the working papers set aside for the evening, while she reviewed a delicate thread of Covenant proxy records, and she spoke about him without being asked, casually, in the way of someone who is comfortable enough in another person's presence to let thoughts surface naturally. Her grandfather had been 23 years old when he signed the original blood debt, she said. Young and desperate, and in love with a woman who carried Covenant blood through a human grandparent, a genetic link that the Covenant used to claim jurisdiction over their entire family line. He had signed the debt because the Covenant had threatened that woman, and the blood law of the time was absolute, and he had been terrified and had made the only choice that felt survivable. He had spent the rest of his life preparing his family to one day survive the consequence of that choice. He had gathered documents, he had built alliances, he had taught his children and his grandchildren, and specifically Seraphina, who he had recognized early as the one most likely to face the reckoning, everything he knew about Covenant law and the politics of the ancient world. He was afraid, she said, every day of his life. He told me that once. He said that fear never went away, but that it could be made useful, that you could carry it like a lantern instead of letting it carry you. Draven was quiet for a moment. The lamp cast warm gold light across the sitting room, and outside, the city moved in its eternal oblivious rhythm. He sounds, Draven said carefully, like someone who understood a great deal about survival. He understood that the world is full of powers that don't care about your comfort, she said. But that doesn't mean you have to surrender your dignity to them. She looked at him. Is that why you're not like the other Covenant lords I've read about? You gave your personal word to a human woman, which I'm told is essentially unprecedented. Why? He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured in the way of someone choosing honesty over habit. Because my mother, he said, was human. Seraphina went very still. She married my father when she was 22, he said, looking at the middle distance, at something 3 centuries back, and still, evidently, present. He was already 300 years old. She was extraordinary. She was fearless and brilliant, and she looked at my father's court and laughed at it, not out of ignorance, but out of a deep and certain clarity about what mattered and what was merely performance. His pale eyes moved to hers. She died when I was 40 years old, which is quite young. For what I am, she was 61. She died as humans die, and my father never recovered from it, and I was left with 4 centuries ahead of me, and the memory of a woman who showed me that human strength is not diminished by being mortal. He paused. I have never been able to look at a human being as lesser since. The sitting room was very quiet. The city lights moved behind the glass. You're alone, Seraphina said, and it was not pity in her voice, it was simply the honest naming of a thing she had observed. I have a court, he said. That's not what I said. He looked at her for a long moment. His pale eyes in the warm lamplight were the color of winter sky just before snow. Yes, he said quietly, I am alone. She reached across the space between them and covered his hand with hers, briefly, just for a moment, the way you might touch someone's arm when words aren't quite sufficient. His hand was cool beneath hers, and absolutely still, and she felt him go very slightly more still the instant she made contact, as though the touch had surprised him into a kind of heightened attention. She pulled her hand back. He did not move for a long moment. We should get back to the Article 23 cross-references, she said. Yes, he agreed, and his voice was not quite its usual thing. The trap came on the 7th night. Seraphina was alone in the penthouse for the first time in a week. Draven had gone to a necessary Covenant meeting, one he could not delay further without signaling awareness of Cravenmore's conspiracy. He had been reluctant to leave, which she found interesting. He had stood at the penthouse door for an additional 40 seconds, beyond the point at which any strategic reason for lingering had passed, looking at her with those pale, careful eyes, and had said, with the particular stiffness of someone making themselves say a thing that feels difficult, do not open the door for anyone without contacting me first. No one from the Covenant will approach you through proper channels while I am present at the meeting. If anyone does contact you, it is not sanctioned by my authority. Then they'd be going around your authority, she said, which means they'd be violating the blood law protections attached to my codex trade. Yes, he said, which means they would have a reason to prefer you unable to testify to that violation. The look they exchanged in that moment was long and very clear. Stay safe, she said. I fully intend to, he said, and then added, as though the words required effort to produce. Please do the same. He left. At 11:47 that night, there was a knock at the penthouse door. Seraphina did not open it. She moved to the secondary entrance of the study, activated the building's secondary security system, which she had quietly upgraded 3 days earlier with a biometric seal that would have impressed a small nation's intelligence agency, and sent Draven a one-word text. Company. His reply came in 45 seconds. Do not open the door. 40 minutes, she typed back. Noted. Also, there are 2 of them based on the weight distribution in the hallway, and one of them has a Covenant seal device. I can see the frequency signature on my security scanner. Your rival is not subtle. 42 seconds of silence. Then, I am leaving now. 25 minutes. Do not engage, she typed. Naturally, she did not open the door. She moved to her desk and opened the recording system she had installed on day 3, which captured audio from the hallway through the building's own security infrastructure, and she listened to the 2 figures outside her door conduct a quiet, incriminating conversation about a direct order from Lord Vasil Cravenmore to acquire the Belmont woman and the documents before Lord Malkavian could present them to the tribunal. She recorded all of it. When Draven arrived, his white hair slightly disordered from what she suspected was a level of physical velocity that human transport could not account for. He was through the window before she had fully processed that he was there. He crossed the room to her in 3 strides and took her by the shoulders, and the grip was careful and firm, and the look on his face was the most unguarded thing she had seen on it in 7 days. You're unharmed, he said, and it was almost a question. Completely, she said. Also, I have a full audio recording of Cravenmore's agents discussing their orders, which constitutes direct evidence of a sanctioned violation of blood law protections. That's considerably better than what we had this morning. He stared at her. You, he said slowly, set them up. I may have sent a very subtle signal through a secondary Covenant frequency that the penthouse would be unguarded this evening, she admitted. I wanted them to come to us, rather than waiting for them to find a moment we weren't prepared for. He dropped his hands from her shoulders. He took 1 step back. He looked at her with an expression that moved through several things very quickly, alarm and incredulity, and then something that resolved into a helpless, astonished look that she had never seen on his face before, and that transformed it completely. You used yourself as bait, he said. Controlled bait, she said, with multiple redundant security systems, a full recording suite, a biometrically sealed room, and you 25 minutes away. 20, he said. I told you 25 because I didn't want you to worry. You were worried, she said. Extraordinarily, he said, and his voice was raw at its edges in a way she had not heard before. He turned away from her, and she saw his hands close briefly at his sides, a controlled, deliberate gesture. The recording, he said, in a voice that had reassembled itself almost completely. Play it for me. She played it. He listened. His expression went very cold and very focused in the way she had come to associate with him operating at his most dangerous, and it was not frightening the way she might have expected. It was actually deeply reassuring. This ends Cravenmore's conspiracy, he said when the recording finished. Combined with the codex and the tribunal audio he is unaware we have, this is irrefutable. He looked at her. You have, in 7 days, dismantled an 11-year political conspiracy. We have, she said. You provided the Covenant law framework without which the documents would mean nothing. He looked at her for a long moment. Seraphina, he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and something about it, the way it sounded in his voice, formal and careful, and somehow also very personal, made her breath do a slightly unsteady thing. When this is over, when the tribunal is done, and the blood law is discharged, and you are free of every Covenant obligation, what will you do? She considered the question honestly. Sleep, she said. For approximately 3 days. And then probably go back to running my family's investment firm, which I have been managing remotely all week, and which is suffering from my distraction. You've been managing your investment firm, he said slowly, while simultaneously dismantling a vampire court conspiracy. Multitasking is a survival skill, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then Draven Malkavian did something she suspected he had not done in a very long time. He laughed. It was brief and quiet and genuine, and it completely restructured his face, and Seraphina felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening onto a room she hadn't known was there. The tribunal was called for 5 days later. In those 5 days, something changed between them with the slow, inevitable quality of a tide coming in. Not dramatically, not in any single moment she could point to with certainty, but in the accumulated weight of 100 small moments. The way he had taken to standing between her and every door when they were in public, not possessively, but with a careful, instinctive protectiveness that she found she did not resent the way she had expected to. The way he listened when she spoke, with the total present attention of someone who had decided that what she said mattered. The way he made an effort, small but consistent, to explain the parts of his world she didn't know, not with the condescension of someone who considered human ignorance amusing, but with the genuine wish of someone who wanted her to understand the context of his life. She told him about her parents, who had died when she was 19 in a car accident that had nothing supernatural about it. That was simply the ordinary, devastating cruelty of ordinary loss. She told him about inheriting the firm and the archives, and her grandfather's files, and a responsibility she had not chosen, but had decided to carry with both hands rather than resent. He told her about the Covenant's founding 300 years ago in the catacombs beneath what is now Vienna. 11 vampire lords sitting in the dark and deciding whether the world was large enough to share with humanity, or whether they should simply take it. He had argued for coexistence, he said. He had argued, in the cold and certain way of someone who has decided a thing and will defend it until the earth turns cold, that a world in which they lived alongside humanity was infinitely more interesting than one in which they ruled it. 7 voted with you, she said. 4 did not, he said. And those 4 have spent 3 centuries looking for ways to prove me wrong. He paused. Vasil Cravenmore's grandfather was one of the 4. Of course he was, she said. It is perhaps not entirely coincidental that he has chosen a human woman as the axis of his current attempt, Draven said carefully. She looked at him. He knows. About your mother, he has always known, and he has always believed it to be a weakness. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that was very old and very quiet. He may not be entirely wrong. I am not perhaps as indifferent to human lives as a purely self-interested Covenant Lord might be. Thank you for that, she said quietly. I didn't say it to earn thanks. I know, she said. That's why I'm giving it. On the evening before the tribunal, he came to her study where she was reviewing her final notes and stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. Seraphina, she looked up. If anything goes wrong tomorrow, he said, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed these words and is still not fully comfortable with them, I want you to know that whatever happens in that tribunal, your freedom is secured. The binding order is destroyed. My personal bond stands regardless of political outcome. You are free, whatever happens. I know, she said. I needed to say it. She set her pen down. She looked at him, this extraordinary, ancient, lonely man standing in the doorway of her study in the city she had always lived in, this being of another world entirely who had come to take her away and had, somewhere in 7 days, stopped wanting to. I know, she said again. Draven. It was the first time she had used his first name. She watched it land on him the way his use of hers had landed on her, watched the slight stillness and the thing that moved behind his pale eyes. You should get some sleep, he said, in a slightly different voice. So should you? I don't, he said. Sleep, particularly. I know, she said, but you could sit here while I finish these notes if you like. You don't have to do anything productive. You could just be here. He sat down. She went back to her notes. He sat in the armchair across the room and read, and the silence between them was the warm, inhabited kind, the kind that only exists between 2 people who have, without quite deciding to, become necessary to each other. The Covenant Tribunal was held beneath the financial district, in a vaulted space beneath a building that the daylight world understood as the lower levels of a private parking garage. In the vampire world, it was the North Chamber, and it had hosted every significant covenant proceeding for the past 140 years. Seraphina descended into it on Draven's left, because the covenant protocol she had memorized specified that a personal bondholder stood on the left, and she had memorized covenant protocol the way she memorized everything, completely. And because knowledge was the most reliable defense available to her, the chamber was cold and magnificent and filled with perhaps 60 vampires, seated in the curved rows of carved stone seating that formed a half circle around the tribunal floor. Their white hair caught the candlelight in varying shades, some pure silver, some winter gold, some the absolute white of deep frost, and their pale eyes tracked Seraphina with the collective attention of 60 predators, watching something walk into their space. She did not look away from any of them. Draven, beside her, was magnificent in the particular way that she had come to associate with him at his most formally powerful, which was less about display and more about a quality of absolute, settled authority, the bearing of someone who has never needed to perform their power, because the power is simply present, self-evident, requiring no embellishment. Vasil Cravenmore was across the chamber, and he was not what she expected. She had imagined, based on the documents, a theatrical villain. Instead, she found a man of perhaps apparent 40, with cold blue eyes and silver-white hair cropped close, dressed in an impeccable dark suit. Watching her arrival with the expression of someone recalculating, he had not expected her to come willingly. He had not expected her to come at all. She met his eyes briefly, then looked away, which she understood from her covenant research was the correct political move, a signal that he did not merit more than a passing acknowledgement. Draven, beside her, noticed. His eyes moved to hers for just a moment, and she caught the infinitesimal shift of expression that she had learned to read as approval. The tribunal opened with the formal recitation of the blood law claims, which took 11 minutes and covered the 3-generation debt in exhaustive detail. The Covenant's presiding elder, a vampire of apparent 60, whose actual age she estimated at somewhere past 600 based on the way the room oriented itself around him, read the terms in Old Covenant Latin with the patience of something that had conducted this particular ritual many times and would conduct it many more. Then Draven rose to present the discharge. He presented the codex first. He presented it with the authentication chain, clearly, systematically, without theatre. He explained the blood law terms, the original intent, the misreadings that had accumulated over decades. The presiding elder examined the documents with 3 appointed archivists, and the chamber was very quiet while they worked. Then came Cravenmore's challenge. He rose and questioned the document's provenance, suggested forgery, suggested manipulation, suggested that Lord Malkavian had compromised his neutrality through an inappropriate relationship with the human claimant. This was, Seraphina noted, the point at which things became interesting. The Covenant seal of authentication, Draven said, in a voice that was absolutely level, was placed on this document in 1961 by archivist Ferenczi, whose signature is present. If you would like to question the authenticity of a Covenant archivist's seal, Lord Cravenmore, I invite you to make that challenge formally. It carries a mandatory tribunal review of every document archivist Ferenczi ever authenticated, which includes, if I am not mistaken, the proxy agreements you registered with minor lords Petrescu, Aldrich, and Voss between 2013 and 2018. The chamber became very, very quiet. Cravenmore's expression did not change, but something behind his cold eyes did. Additionally, Draven continued, in the same even voice, I present to this tribunal a recording of 2 agents operating under direct mandate from Lord Cravenmore, taken 8 days ago, in which they discuss explicit orders to unlawfully acquire a person under blood law protection and remove documents that are Covenant legal property. He produced the recording device and played 20 seconds of the most damning section. The chamber remained absolutely silent throughout. This constitutes a direct violation of blood law articles 8, 14, and 29. I would normally address such violations through private Covenant arbitration. However, given the pattern of behavior the tribunal is now reviewing, I believe the record should be public. Vasil Cravenmore stood. He opened his mouth. Lord Cravenmore. The presiding elder's voice carried the weight of 6 centuries. You will sit. He sat. The discharge of the blood debt was ratified within the hour. The full terms were written into the permanent covenant record. The Belmont family's 3-generation obligation was formally irrevocably terminated. The presiding elder looked at Seraphina directly and spoke the release formula in Old Covenant Latin. And she heard every word of it because she had memorized the formula, and she wanted to know the exact moment she was free. The investigation into Cravenmore's violation was opened formally, which meant he would face his own tribunal within 60 days. Draven's authority over the Northern Territories was reaffirmed as absolute. As they left the chamber, Seraphina did not look back. In the elevator rising back to the city surface, they were alone for the first time in hours. The chamber had been suffocating with politics and old power, and a tension that had required every bit of her attention to navigate. Now the elevator hummed upward, and the city waited above them, and she could feel the release of tension in her own body, like a physical unwinding. "You were extraordinary in there," Draven said, and the simplicity of the statement made it feel more significant than elaboration would have. "You were terrifying," she said, in the best possible way. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and meant it, completely. She paused. "You? Better than I have been in a considerable amount of time," he said, which was. She understood, an enormous thing for him to say. The elevator reached the surface level. The doors opened onto the parking structure's ordinary concrete, and beyond it through the exit, the city night, full of its ordinary brilliant life. She walked out into it, and the cold air touched her face, and she stood for a moment just breathing it. He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the particular cool steadiness of his presence. "The penthouse," he said after a moment. "Your documents are still there." "Yes," she said. "I suppose I should retrieve my coat." She looked at him. He was looking at the city, its million lights reflected in his pale eyes, and his expression was doing the thing she had come to know, the careful, guarded thing that appeared when he was about to say something that required effort. "You should stay," she said, before he could navigate his way to whatever indirect approach he was planning. Not for the coat, not for the documents. She met his eyes when he looked at her. "Just stay." He was very still for a moment. "Seraphina," he said carefully. "I should explain what that would mean. I am not, as I suspect you have gathered, someone who stays anywhere casually. If I stay, I stay." He paused. "I should also explain that I have not, in the last 7 days, wanted to leave, which is itself a thing I have not experienced in a very long time, and which I understand, if you are being generous enough to offer it, should be stated honestly rather than concealed behind strategic necessity." "I know," she said. "I've known for several days. You didn't say anything. I was waiting for you to be ready to say it yourself." He looked at her for a long moment. The city lights moved around them, brilliant and alive and entirely indifferent to two people standing in a parking exit deciding something enormous. "I am," he said, "not the simplest person to love." "I'm not particularly simple either," she said. "You are human," he said, carefully. "You are mortal. I am not. I have watched people I loved grow old and leave." His voice was steady, but there was weight behind it, old and real. "I would not ask you to ignore that complication." "It is a complication," she agreed. "It is not a reason to stand in a parking garage and let something real walk away from us." She looked at him steadily. "There are options for mortals connected to the Covenant world, as I'm sure you know better than I do. I have read the codex thoroughly. Article 31 covers voluntary transition requests." He went very still. "That is not a decision to be made quickly. I know, I'm not making it tonight. I'm saying it exists, and we can discuss it honestly when we're ready, and that neither of us needs to treat the future as a door that's already closed." She met his pale eyes. "That is a conversation for people who have decided to be together. I'm suggesting we decide that first." "Are you suggesting," he said slowly, "that you would like to be with me?" "I'm suggesting that I have spent the past 7 days becoming more interested in your company than I have been in any person's company in a very long time," she said. "And that I find you remarkable and infuriating and funny in ways you don't intend, and deeply, genuinely kind beneath 4 centuries of armor. And that the idea of you leaving is considerably more uncomfortable than the idea of whatever complicated thing it would mean for you to stay." She looked at him. "Yes, that is what I'm suggesting." He stepped toward her. slowly, deliberately. The way he moved when he was being careful with something he did not want to damage. He reached out and tucked a strand of dark hair back from her face, and his hand was cool and steady and extraordinarily gentle, and he looked at her with those pale winter eyes and all the centuries behind them. "Then I stay," he said. She reached up and covered his hand with hers, where it rested against her cheek, and felt him lean slightly into the touch the way he had done every time she had reached for him in these 7 days, with the quiet, helpless quality of something that has been cold for a long time and has just found warmth. "Good," she said. He kissed her then, or she kissed him, or it happened in the space between one and the other, where such distinctions stop mattering. It was soft and certain, and tasted like 4 centuries of waiting for something worth staying still for. And she thought distantly that there were people walking past the parking structure exit 10 feet away who would see nothing extraordinary, and would never know that this was the moment a vampire lord, who had come to a city to take a woman away, first understood that he was not going anywhere. The weeks that followed were not without their complications. Cravenmore's tribunal produced 3 additional conspirators within the Northern Covenant. Minor lords whose proxy agreements had been built on coercion rather than genuine alliance, and unpicking those alliances required Draven's consistent attention and Seraphina's analytical precision in equal measure. She worked on it from her firm's conference room in the mornings and from the penthouse in the evenings, and Draven moved fluidly between the old world and the new one, between Covenant politics and the extraordinary novelty of learning what it meant to share a life with a person who would not be diminished by proximity to his authority. He was protective in the way she had expected from everything she had read about him, automatic and absolute. When a Covenant minor lord came to the penthouse to protest the tribunal's outcome and was rude to Seraphina in a way that was intended to signal her inferior standing, Draven's response was so quiet and so final that the minor lord left white-faced and did not return. When a situation required her to attend a secondary Covenant function, Draven stood between her and every uncertain situation without being asked, without making a performance of it, as though it were simply the obvious and correct arrangement of things. She found to her slight surprise that she did not resent this. She had spent her life being competent and independent, precisely because there had been no one she trusted enough to let stand beside her. This was different. This was not someone standing in front of her and obscuring the view. This was someone standing beside her with absolute confidence in her capability and adding his formidable presence to hers, and the combination was, honestly, quite something. He was learning her world too, in his careful, thorough way. He asked about her firm with genuine interest. He read the investment analyses she left on the table with the focused attention he gave to Covenant documents. He asked intelligent questions about modern market mechanics and economic theory, and when she explained concepts his 347 years of prior experience had not covered, he listened with the same focused respect with which she had listened to him explain Covenant law. He had opinions about architecture. She discovered this accidentally when she mentioned that the firm's new office building was going to have the most aggressively mediocre facade in the city, and he said, with the controlled despair of someone who had watched architectural beauty be replaced by architectural convenience for 3 centuries, that modern buildings had forgotten that the external face of a structure communicated something to the people who lived near it. That beauty in public spaces was not vanity but generosity. "Write that down," she said. "I'm sending it to the architect. I am not sending architectural criticism to a human architect on behalf of a vampire who is technically not supposed to exist within modern municipal frameworks." "I'll paraphrase," she said. The facade was subsequently revised. She did not tell him this for 2 weeks, and when she did, over dinner, his expression moved through several things and landed on something that looked startlingly like delight. Dinner, she had discovered, was a complicated topic. He did not require human food in the conventional sense, which she had understood intellectually, but found required some genuine adjustment in practice. He fed as vampires fed. Though he was meticulous and ethical about the sources he used, a Covenant-maintained network of willing donors, which he explained to her with the careful directness of someone who believed in honesty, even when a subject was uncomfortable. She had asked all the questions that a thorough and unsentimental person asks, and he had answered all of them, and they had worked through it together with the same methodology they had applied to everything else. Honestly, thoroughly, and without pretending the complications were not there. She cooked anyway. It gave her something to do in the evenings, and she liked cooking, and she found that he liked sitting in the kitchen while she cooked, nursing a glass of wine he didn't need, and reading or talking or simply being present in the quiet, comfortable way that she had come to rely on. "You don't have to sit here," she said one evening. "I know," he said, and turned a page. She had thought once that the complication of his nature would erect a permanent distance between them, a glass wall of fundamental difference that no amount of affection could quite dissolve. She had been wrong. The difference was real, and it required ongoing honesty and adjustment, but it did not create distance. If anything, the fact that they had looked at every difficult thing directly and spoken about it without flinching was what made the closeness between them feel unlike anything she had known. There was no performance between them, no management of impressions. They had started their entire relationship in the middle of an honest, high-stakes confrontation, and that beginning had shaped everything that followed. 3 months after the tribunal, on an evening in late November, when the city's first real cold had arrived and the penthouse windows were blurred with condensation from the warmth inside, Draven brought her something. It was not wrapped or presented with ceremony. He simply placed a document on the table while she was working and said, "Read this when you have a moment," and went to make himself useful with the coffee, which he had learned to make exactly the way she liked it. She picked up the document. It was a formal covenant petition, prepared in the precise legal language of ancient blood law, requesting a voluntary transition hearing under Article 31 of the Heiress codex, submitted by Lord Draven Malkavian on behalf of Seraphina Belmont, conditional on her freely given and fully informed consent. The petition outlined, in complete and scrupulous detail, every implication of the process, every change, every choice, every right she would retain, and everything that would be different from it. It was comprehensive and exact, and had clearly been prepared with the kind of care that required considerable time. At the bottom, in his precise pre-typewriter handwriting, he had added a single line that was not in legal language. "This is not an obligation or a request. It is a door, and you may decide whether to open it at any time or never, and I will love you exactly equally in either case." Seraphina sat with the document for a long time. The city moved outside the windows, brilliant and indifferent. The coffee on the counter was warm. She thought about her grandfather, who had been afraid every day and had made that fear useful. She thought about parents who had not had the years that she was now being offered. She thought about herself at 19, inheriting everything and deciding to carry it, and herself now sitting in a penthouse with a remarkable, ancient, complicated man who had come to take her away and had stayed instead. She thought about the future, which had always been a finite corridor, and was now, if she chose, something considerably larger. She was not afraid. She was, in fact, the furthest from afraid she had ever been. She picked up her pen. She added her signature below his single handwritten line. She looked at him across the kitchen, where he was watching her with the careful, guarded expression that she could read now as clearly as print. "You don't have to decide today," he said, with the controlled tension of someone trying very hard to mean it. "I know," she said. "I decided." He crossed the kitchen, and she stood to meet him, and he took the document from her hand and looked at her signature, and then he looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she thought he had probably not worn in a very long time, something open and unguarded and unutterably relieved. "Are you certain?" he said. "Draven." She took his face in her hands, cool and still beneath her warm palms, and looked at him directly with all the steady certainty she possessed. "I am absolutely certain." He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, the winter grey of his gaze was the warmest thing she had ever seen. He pressed his forehead to hers, gently, and held her by her arms, and stood there breathing in the particular way that people breathe when they have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and have been permitted, at last, to set it down. "I have been alone," he said quietly, against her hair, "for a very long time." "I know," she said. "You mentioned that once." "I did." He pulled back slightly to look at her. I should tell you that I am not by nature a simple person to share a life with. I have 4 centuries of habit and 300 years of a court that requires my consistent attention and a complicated existence that will ask things of you that an ordinary life would not. And in exchange, she said, meeting his eyes, I get you, which is not a small thing. Something moved through his expression that she thought might have been the closest a 400-year-old vampire lord could come to being undone. No, he agreed, and his voice was soft. It is not a small thing. Then we are in agreement, she said. He kissed her, and it was different from the first time in the parking garage exit, deeper and more certain. The kiss of 2 people who have stopped negotiating with the future and simply claimed it. The voluntary transition process was, as Draven had promised, thorough and unhurried. The Covenant's formal proceedings took 4 months to complete, with multiple hearings and consultations, and the kind of careful documentation that the ancient blood law required for any irreversible change. Seraphina attended every proceeding with the same focused preparation she had brought to the original tribunal. She asked every question, she understood everything. The presiding elder, who had ratified the blood debt discharge, and who Seraphina had concluded was significantly more reasonable than the Covenant's reputation suggested, conducted the final hearing himself and asked her 3 times, in 3 different ways, whether she was acting of her own free will without coercion or pressure. She answered him 3 times, clearly and directly, and on the 3rd answer she looked at Draven across the chamber and held his gaze while she spoke. And the presiding elder followed her look and made a small sound that might, in 600 years of formal proceedings, have been the closest he had come to expressing something sentimental. The change itself happened on a night in early spring, 4 months after Seraphina, the petition. She will not describe it fully, because some things are private. What she will say, if asked, is that it was not what she expected in the ways she had most feared, and was exactly what she had hoped for in the ways that mattered. She woke on the morning after to find the world having acquired new dimensions of clarity. The city outside the penthouse windows brilliant and detailed in the pre-dawn dark, in a way that was almost overwhelming, and Draven sitting in the armchair beside her with the patient, watchful stillness of someone who has been there for hours and considers this exactly where he should be. Good morning, he said. She sat up and looked at the world, which was the same world and was also entirely different, and then looked at him. Good morning, she said, and then, because she was Seraphina Belmont and honesty was her native language. The city is extraordinary. Yes, he said, it becomes more so. She stood and crossed to the window, and he came to stand beside her, and the 2 of them looked out at the city in the last dark before dawn, all its million brilliant points of light shifting and alive. Sunrise in 4 minutes, he said. She looked at him. We should move back from the window. We have a few moments yet, Draven. She caught his arm. The blackout panels are set, he said. It is a precaution, not a certainty. He looked at her with warm, pale eyes. But I appreciate the reflex. 4 centuries of self-preservation, she said dryly, and you stand next to windows to watch sunrises you cannot see. I used to watch them often, he said, before. There was something in his voice that was very old and very quiet. I can see the edges of them still, in the light they leave behind on buildings. The quality of the reflected light in the first hour, it is not the same. But it is something. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned to the window and looked at the city, and described what she saw as the sun came up, the particular colors of it, the way the light moved across the buildings, warm and specific and alive. And he stood beside her and listened with his pale eyes on the bright world he could not directly see. She would do this, she decided, every morning that required it. The small particular translations of one world into another. That was what love was, after all. Not the absence of difference, but the willingness to bridge it. Cravenmore's tribunal concluded 6 weeks later. He was stripped of his proxy alliances. His territorial claims were reduced to their original historical limits, and he was formally censured for the violation of blood law protections. It was, by Covenant standards, a significant humiliation, though not the destruction of him entirely. Draven accepted the outcome with the equanimity of someone who prefers lasting political stability to the satisfying but destabilizing option of annihilation. "You could have had more," Seraphina observed. "I could have," he agreed. And in 5 decades he would have been replaced by someone more careful, who had learned from his mistakes. "A censured rival who knows the limits of my patience is more manageable than a martyr's legacy." "You've been doing this for a very long time," she said. "I have," he said, "and for the first time in a very long time I find I would like to continue doing it rather than merely enduring it." He looked at her with a directness that still had the power to stop her breath. "That is your influence. You were always capable of it," she said. "You just needed someone who wasn't going to accept anything less." "Yes," he said. "I needed you." The penthouse changed over the following months in small and meaningful ways. His books appeared on the shelves alongside hers. His coat was reliably on the hook by the door. The guest room was reconfigured because it was no longer needed as a separate space. The building's blackout systems were upgraded throughout the top 2 floors. She had a Covenant protocol line installed directly in the study, which he had initially called unnecessary, and which she had ignored him about completely. He learned gradually the rhythms of her working life, and she learned the rhythms of his court attendance, and they built between them a life that existed in 2 worlds simultaneously, his ancient and hers modern, and found that the overlap was larger than either of them had expected. She ran the Belmont firm with the same focused precision she had always applied, and it thrived, and she expanded it, and on the day she made a particularly satisfying acquisition that she had been working toward for 3 months. She told him about it over dinner, and he listened with genuine engagement and said, "You're going to purchase the secondary firm as well, aren't you? The one that services the northern accounts." And she looked at him and said, "How did you figure that out?" And he said, "You have been asking questions about their compliance record for 3 weeks. You only research compliance when you intend to acquire." And she looked at him with the expression she wore when something delighted her. "You've been paying attention," she said. "I always pay attention to you," he said, and it was completely simple and completely true. She brought him into certain aspects of the firm's historical work, the archival research, the old-world document authentication that occasionally crossed the desk of an investment firm that had 3 generations of ties to the most powerful vampire court in the Northern Hemisphere. He navigated those cases with the ease of lived expertise, and the combination of his knowledge and her methodology was, in practice, formidable. They were, in the particular way of 2 people who were both better individually than most, and were somehow considerably more so together, an excellent pair. The Northern Covenant stabilized. Without Cravenmore's conspiracy eroding its foundations, the old alliances held better than they had in decades. Draven's authority, reaffirmed by the tribunal, was no longer contested. The minor lords who had been coerced into the proxy agreements came, one by one, and made direct pledges, and the covenant that had been slowly hollowed by 11 years of secret manipulation began, slowly, to rebuild. He attributed this, when asked by the Covenant's presiding elder during a formal review, primarily to the intelligence work that had exposed the conspiracy. The intelligence work, the presiding elder said, with a careful precision that suggested he knew exactly where the intelligence work had come from, was excellent. "My partner," Draven said, which was such a complete and unembellished truth that the presiding elder, who was 600 years old and had thought himself beyond being surprised, briefly lost the composed neutrality of his expression. "The human heiress," the elder said. "Seraphina Malkavian," Draven said, which was the first time he had used that name publicly, and the calm certainty with which he said it suggested. It was not a statement he was trying out, but one he had been carrying quietly for some time. The presiding elder considered this for a moment. He looked at the chamber around them, the restored order of it, the stability that had replaced the slow erosion of the previous decade. "She is," he said finally, "not what we anticipated." "No," Draven agreed, "she is considerably more." Seraphina, in her office on the 41st floor, was reviewing a contract that had nothing to do with vampire courts or blood laws or ancient conspiracies. It was a perfectly ordinary real estate acquisition with a perfectly ordinary projected return, and she was reading it with the focused, clean attention of someone who is exactly where she should be, doing exactly what she has chosen. Her phone lit with a message from Draven. The Elder sends his regards. He described you as not what was anticipated. I told him you were considerably more. She read this. She smiled. She typed back. High praise from someone 600 years old. His reply. He also asked if you would consider serving as a formal covenant advisor. I told him that was your decision to make entirely. She sat with this for a moment. Outside her window, the city moved in its brilliant ordinary daylight, which she could see more clearly than she ever had in her human life. Every detail precise and vivid and extraordinary. She thought about her grandfather, carrying fear like a lantern. She thought about the blood debt that had shaped 3 generations of her family. She thought about the moment she had stood in her penthouse and decided to meet a vampire lord, not with terror but with strategy. And everything that had followed from that decision, she typed back. Tell him I'll consider it. On the condition that the advisory role is entirely voluntary, carries no blood law obligations, and comes with full access to the complete Covenant archive. 3 seconds, his reply. He agreed immediately and seemed pleased. He also asked how you knew he would agree. She smiled again. Because it's a good deal for everyone, she typed. And good deals don't require pressure. She set her phone down and went back to the contract. The city moved outside. Everything was bright and clear, and hers, every bit of it chosen, every bit of it earned. That evening, he was home before her. She came through the door to find him in the kitchen, which was not unusual, and to find him attempting, with the concentrated attention of someone who has decided to master a thing, to recreate a pasta dish she had made 3 weeks earlier, which was considerably more unusual. What are you doing? She said. Cooking, he said, with a dignity that the situation did not entirely support, as the kitchen was somewhat chaotic and he was holding a wooden spoon with the careful grip of someone who has never previously needed to think about wooden spoons. You don't eat pasta, she said. You do, he said. And you worked a 14-hour day. I thought you might like to come home to dinner. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at this extraordinary, ancient, beautiful, slightly flowery person who had come to her city to take her away and had stayed instead, and who was standing in her kitchen trying to cook pasta because she had worked a long day. Is that? She said, managing to keep her voice almost entirely steady. Basil or parsley? The recipe specified basil, he said. I acquired basil. Good, she said. She came into the kitchen and set her bag down and kissed him. And he kissed her back and left a slight impression of flour on her cheek that she did not discover until she saw her reflection later, and that she left there because some things are worth being slightly ridiculous about. How was the elders' meeting? She said. Productive, he said. He offered you the advisory role. I know. You texted me. I told him your conditions, he agreed. He also said, and I am quoting directly, that your grandfather would have been proud. He paused over the pasta. I believe that to be true. She looked at him. I believe it too, she said quietly. They ate dinner, which was genuinely quite good, at the table that had once been covered in ancient documents and conspiracy evidence, and was now simply a dinner table in the penthouse that had once been a defensive position and was now simply home. He told her about the meeting's political details. She told him about the contract. They argued companionably about the architectural merits of a building she had passed that day, and he had not seen but had opinions about anyway based on her description. She corrected a piece of Covenant legal history he had slightly misremembered, and he accepted the correction with the good humor he had learned, slowly and deliberately, to extend to being wrong, which was one of the things she had taught him that he considered among the most valuable. Later, when the city was dark, and they were in the sitting room with the lights low and the windows clear to the million brilliant points beyond. She sat beside him and leaned into the cool, steady weight of him, and he put his arm around her with the natural ease of something that has become simply how things are. We should discuss the Covenant advisory role seriously, she said. I know, he said. It would mean deeper formal ties to the court. Yes, I'm not afraid of that, she said. I just want to be intentional about it. I want to go in with clear parameters. You always want clear parameters, he said, with warm, specific affection. It is one of my better qualities, she said. It is, he agreed and pressed a kiss to her hair. Outside, the city was all its brilliant self, indifferent and magnificent. full of ordinary people living ordinary lives that contained no vampire courts or ancient blood laws or three-generation debts being finally completely permanently resolved, and inside, in the warm and ordinary extraordinary of a life that had been built piece by piece out of honesty and strategy and love, two people sat in the low light of a night they had chosen and were exactly where they should be. There was no more blood law, no more hidden motive, no more forbidden standing, no more ancient vow hanging over them like a blade. The dangerous devotion that had been forged in the middle of a crisis had become, with time and care and the daily practice of choosing each other, simply love, uncomplicated by fear, uncomplicated by debt, complicated only by the ordinary beautiful work of two people building something together. Draven Malkavian, Lord of the Northern Covenant, who had come to a city on a binding order and left with something he had not expected and could not relinquish, looked at the woman beside him and felt the long, cold weight of 4 centuries settle into something entirely different, not burden, not solitude, not the practiced endurance of someone who has decided that feeling things deeply is an inconvenience best minimized. Something warm, something certain. Something that had, in the end, been entirely worth every complication and every risk and every moment of that extraordinary, difficult, luminous 7 days when everything began. Seraphina Belmont. Heiress to a blood debt that no longer existed, advisor to a court that no longer frightened her, woman who had faced the most dangerous vampire lord in the Northern Hemisphere across her own dining table and had made him stay, looked out at the city that had always been hers and felt the simple, clean, enormous peace of someone who has at last exactly what they chose. She turned and looked at him, and he looked at her, and between them was the uncomplicated truth of two people who had looked at every hard thing together and had not flinched from any of it. "I love you," she said. The words were very simple. She said them with the same directness with which she said everything else, without embellishment, without deflection. He looked at her for a moment with everything he was. 4 centuries and a mother's memory and the loneliness of a court that had never been enough and the extraordinary particular relief of a man who had stopped expecting to find something worth staying for. "I love you," he said, and the city went on shining, and the night went on being, the night, and the two of them sat in the middle of it all, whole and unhurried and entirely, completely home.